Good evening, and welcome to the second Arlington Advocates for Restorative Justice Town Hall meeting. My name is Lauren Epstein, and I will be your moderator tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have restorative justice experts Dwanna Nicole and Dr. Martha Brown. Dwanna is a restorative justice practitioner and trainer with the Restorative Justice Partnership. She has developed toolkits for educators to provide an overview of restorative practices and how they can be useful in building relationships with students and improving school climate. Dwanna works within school communities throughout the country to assist them with developing strategies to create a more positive school climate for students, educators, and their families. By using a collaborative model that includes stakeholders at every level, she provides training and support in the implementation of restorative justice in schools through the creation of individualized short and long-term implementation plans, resource development, complementary professional learning, and on-site assistance. Prior to her work with the Restorative Justice Partnership, Dwanna served as Advancement Projects Director of Policy and Stakeholder Outreach. Welcome, Dwanna. Also we have with us is Dr. Brown. She is president and founder of RJAE Consulting and is an active member of the American Evaluation Association, the Canadian Evaluation Society, and the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. She received her doctorate in curriculum and instruction from Florida Atlantic University in 2015 and is an accomplished author, evaluator, program designer, presenter, trainer, and teacher. Dr. Brown's research has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and edited books. She authored the best-selling book, Creating Restorative Schools, Setting Schools Up to Succeed, which is available from Living Justice Press. She has presented at numerous national and international conferences on the topics of educational policy reform, restorative justice, arts, education, and culturally responsible evaluation. So in Arlington, Virginia, a working group has been developing a restorative justice plan that will be submitted to our county board by the end of this year. The goal of our group, Arlington Advocates for Restorative Justice, and these town halls is to inform you, Arlingtonians, what restorative justice is and its impact, what it would be on our justice system, educational system, and communities. Restorative justice has a good deal of ambiguity to it. I've been learning about it over the last few months, and I'm still not clear. The overarching premise, though, is to develop innovative solutions to address wrongdoing by focusing on healing and fairness for both victims and offenders instead of retribution. Tonight, our experts will do a deep dive on restorative justice in schools. They will answer your questions throughout the program. Please know that we are video recording this event, which will be posted to YouTube. You are welcome to enter your questions by clicking the Q&A button below. Every few minutes, we'll pause and have our guests answer a question. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know there's a million other places you could be, so we appreciate your time. So let's begin. So Dwanna and Martha, again, thank you so much for being here with us. Let's dive in and start the conversation. So Dwanna, we're going to start with you first, and Martha, you guys can just, get going, but I'll kick off our questions. Can you, Dwanna, give us a brief overview of what restorative justice looks like in schools?
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to be with you all today. So restorative justice in schools really centers on the building of relationships. And so I know that there's a narrative that exists that really frames restorative justice in schools as the alternative to suspensions, the alternative to expulsions or disciplinary measures. And the idea, though, is that that actually can't happen unless there are the relationships that exist beforehand. And so if we're centering building relationships, and that's just not about the young people, that's how do we build relationships with each other as adults? How do we extend those relationships to our young people? And then how do we allow our young people to build relationships with each other. But especially for adults, how do we model that throughout our school communities? And so if I'm asking you how you're doing and I'm halfway down the hall when we do reopen, before I hear your answer, that's actually not the type of relationships that we want. So once those relationships are established, when there is harm, we can actually come together and repair that harm in a way that meets the needs of everyone affected. That gives the person who was harmed a say in what they need to feel whole, but it also allows us to sometimes meet the needs of the person who committed the harm. And so we don't see behavior as wrongdoing or something bad, I should say. We see it as an opportunity to learn and explore, and behavior as a form of communication. So when I'm doing something, I'm communicating a need, and it's often that need that goes unaddressed that leads to those repeat behaviors. And so I'd like to just say, when we're in relationship with each other, we are less likely to cause harm. But harm will always occur when human beings are involved. There's not a reason to fear conflict. It's a natural thing. But I'm more likely to sit with you and make it right when I have that relationship with you. And so it's about how do we shift our education systems to prioritize the relationship building and understand that that's really the foundation for everything that we do. Because there's nothing to restore to if those relationships don't exist.
Martha, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, and it was perfect. So I'm just going to pull out the book, The Little Book of Restorative Justice and Education by Kathy Evans and Dorothy Vandering, which I really recommend everyone read because this book provides the real solid theory of we call it RJE. And their definition is that restorative justice and education can be defined as facilitating learning communities that nurture the capacity of people to engage with one another and their environment in a manner that supports and respects the inherent dignity and worth of all. So it just piggybacks on what Dwanna says. It is about creating a space within school where people are valued, respected, where there's mutual concern for each other, and relationships are at the heart of everything. And since prior to the webcast, Lauren, you said we could pontificate. I will, and I will say there's, in their definition, the word discipline does not appear because it's not about that. And I think Dwanna and I both agree that, and I actually heard Dorothy talking about it the other day, that restorative justice came into schools 30 years ago as an alternative disciplinary route that people could take. I've referred to it, and others have referred to it, as a kinder, gentler way to punish kids. So the original versions, and I think it's the version people default to because it's been around a long time, is that it is that traditional restorative justice response to harm. The RJE approach.
Can you give us an example before you go on? What does that mean exactly? Give me an example of how that looked.
What it looked like was that schools would either hire a restorative justice coordinator that they would send the kids to handle the problem kids or to handle discipline, however it was. There's been a lot of pressure on schools over the past decade to decrease the number of suspensions because of the disproportionality of Black and gay and special needs students who are being suspended from school. So the quick fix for principals and school districts was, hey, let's throw RJ at this and we won't suspend the kids then. But it offered nothing in terms of cultural change in the school. And schools historically are sources of harm in a lot of ways. Schools have traumatized a lot of people. They're not particularly the most welcoming places. And since NCLB in 2000 and the advent of zero tolerance policies, they become
what's
less
NCLB?
welcoming.
Martha,
No Child Left Behind.
Okay.
Where the focus is no longer on the student and a holistic education, it's on test scores. So between the dehumanization of students since 2000 and the whole country's lean towards zero tolerance, that if you break a rule or make a mistake, you're out. It has just exacerbated the already unjust educational system.
So let me, I want to reframe the question. I'm sorry, Martha, I'm totally interrupting you, and I know I said pontificate, but I wanted to, because I want to understand, and I think people who don't know anything about this might want to understand. when you say 30 years ago, they would throw an RJ person, can you give me like a specific use case or an example of how that would look for students? So a student does something wrong, what would happen?
Theoretically, there would be then a conversation with that student. If it were done, if it was true restorative justice, the person who was harmed and the person who caused the harm would be brought together to come up with a resolution on how to make things right based on the needs of the person who was harmed, whether that was the teacher, another student. But it really never got to the point where they were addressing the whole community. So if a kid acts out, let's say a kid, like one of my former students, throws a tantrum in a classroom and throws a desk and runs out of the room, that harm was not just committed against me, it was committed against the entire classroom. So it's not enough to just have that conversation with the kid or have that restorative conversation with me and the teacher. There has to be a restoration with that classroom community. But like Dwanna said, if you never built that community in the first place, what's there to restore? So we're both working to change the definition, change the dialogue, change the concept of RG as focus on that community building, focusing on that relationship. So then when harm does occur, and it always will, we have something to stand on.
So Dwanna, what would be like a first step to starting, because it sounds like what you're both saying is relationship first. What would be the first thing to do in implementing restorative justice?
So the first thing that we do when we work at a school level is to really spend a lot of time doing education. As Martha was alluding to, when we know that this narrative exists, right? There's a lot of things that restorative justice isn't. It's not classroom management. It's not a program. It's not something that you do just when there's harm. It's not something that's just for students. But that we know already that that's the narrative that exists. We actually have to spend quite a bit of time undoing that narrative. And so if we walk in and we're trying to train people and we're talking about restorative justice, but no one in the building knows what we mean, or they believe that they think that we know that they know what we mean, or they have this different view, or multiple people have different views, that really creates issues down the road. And so the very first thing that we've done and that we've learned by our own trial and error is that we actually really have to spend the time in making sure that everyone in the school community understands what we mean when we say restorative justice, and also understands what we don't mean when we say restorative justice. So the very first thing we do is work on an education and awareness piece to get the staff and young people and the families at the same time all up to speed, much like what you're doing right now in Arlington, making sure that everyone knows what we're talking about.
So you set the context so that everyone and all the stakeholders, the students, the teachers, the parents understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And just as an example, what would that look like? What does that look like?
Sure. So we actually use the little book of restorative justice in education that Martha just held up by Doctors Kathy Evans and Dorothy Vandering.
Martha, hold that up so in case anyone wants to buy it, if they're interested.
Yep.
Cool.
You can find it on Living Justice Press. We actually use that as a book study. That book does a really great job of emphasizing the importance of relationship building, emphasizing the inherent worth and dignity that exists within all people, including young people, right, who are their own people, right, not something that we are shaping and molding, but people who already exist in this world. And so we actually we walk educators through that process of reading that book, and we know that at the end of that, they've at least all received the understanding of it. What also happens in those spaces is we often can identify folks who are already who are right on board, right? Who are like, I'm ready to run, tell me what to do. I really believe in this. We identify the folks who are more on the edge and like, oh, I'll wait and see. I'm not quite sure what this will look like yet. And importantly, we also identify the folks who are like, you know what, I just don't know if I want to do this. And that's important because oftentimes, in my experience in educational spaces, we spend a lot of time trying to move the folks who are hardest to move, with the thought that if we can just get those folks on board, we'll grab everyone else. But in the process of doing that, what we don't do is provide adequate resources and support to the people who are already with us and helping us get to another level. So that process of reading that book also shows us where we can invest first? Who can we invest in first so we can get more people on our board, just so we can have more people in the building or in our school communities who get this and who are willing to bring their colleagues along. So those book studies not only offer an opportunity for learning for the participants, but they also offer a great opportunity for us who are leading them to show where we can start in the school.
It's really an interesting thing that happens within the first, I don't know, depending on how long the training is, right? Within the first hour to 3 hours of the training, two questions always come up. How do I fix this kid, or what do I do with this kid? Like the teachers are there to find a solution with that problem behavior. And what do we do with the people who don't want to do with this? It's like at the forefront of their thinking.
What do you tell them?
Exactly what Dwanna said. And the thing is, I mean, my kind of rule of thumb is if you can get 75% of the staff in the school to buy into this, you're so far ahead of the curve. There are studies out there that teachers' beliefs will change when their behaviors change. So when they see things happening, when they are able to say to another teacher, "Man, this kid acts up in my class every day, but he never acts up with you. What are you doing different?" That's where you want to get him to. And then some of them just leave. Some of them, if just are so ingrained in punitive thinking and have such a deep relationship with punishment that they then will go to a school that still practices punishment where they're more comfortable. But we don't want this to be an approach like, if you're not on the, if you're not on the train, you're going to get run over or you got to get off. Restorative justice by its very nature is inherently invitational. You want to create the space and invite people to come in because it is a radical 180-degree shift in thinking for most educators and most people in the world, because we are all deeply ingrained in our beliefs about punishment because of the society that we live in, which is deeply ingrained in punishment.
So we're going to
all over the place. You show up for a protest now, you get punished. So we are really up against, and Howard Zinn refers to it as a paradigm shift, and it is a complete change in the way we think about everything, each other and ourselves.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to go to one of the first Q&A. I want to just remind all the folks that are here, thank you so much for being here. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll be getting to them every so many minutes. We'll take a pause and have our guests answer your questions. I just wanted to paraphrase and just kind of reflect on what both of you are saying. So in my family unit, where my wife and I, if one of us does something wrong, there's the punishment is usually kind of talking it. There's no punishment. We talk it through. We try to get to the underlying reasons of where the harm came from. And in my experience, because I make lots of mistakes, my wife forgives me once she understands that there was something underneath it. It wasn't like for example, this isn't true, but if I, left the toothpaste uncapped, right? It could be because I'm just rushed to get to work, but that she doesn't know that, right? So we'll have a conversation about that and come up with some kind of remedy. I know this might be simplifying it, but is basically that what we're talking about here, is that you kind of try to get underneath what happened to find out what the motivation might have been?
Yeah, I think so. Two beautiful mentors of mine, Cheryl Graves and Ora Shub out of Chicago, they often, or Ora has since passed, but they often would say, restorative justice is what you do in your own family, right? And so when, I have a little toddler, you may hear her in the background, you probably heard her earlier, and I talk about her a lot. When she was a little bit younger, she went through this phase where she would get sleepy and she would hit people. And she's a baby who's grown up in circles. She's grown up around a lot of people. So she'd be in the arms of a lot of people. Some of those people she would not know yet, but she would get tired and she would hit them. And it tore me apart, because I'm just like, you don't hit people. That's not the right thing to do. But I also know that she's a baby, right? And she's learning, right? She's communicating to me and to whoever's holding her that she is sleeping and she needs to sleep. And my response, I could yell at her, which is pointless, right? Because she doesn't understand, right? I could hit her, which is even worse because that's actually reinforcing the behavior that I don't want to see. And so we would talk to her. No, we don't hit. We'd hold her hand, ask her if she's sleepy, right? We went through this entire process to get her out of it. What I didn't do was punish her. What I didn't do was send her away for 3 days, right? So when there's harm in our family, because we love each other, we do exactly what you do in your family. We talk it out. We work it out. We have patience. We give second and third and 20th chances to each other because we love each other. When I get mad at my partner, I don't say, I need you to leave the house for 3 days and then come back, and we're never actually going to talk about what happened between us. And I'm still going to be mad at you when you come back because we haven't talked. We sit down together and we work it out. And what that means sometimes is that doesn't always happen in the moment. Sometimes we need cooling off spaces, right? Sometimes we have to go to our separate spaces or rooms and get ourselves back together, but we always come back together and we always talk it out. So we really are in essence saying restorative justice is simply what you do in your own families, and you do that because you love one another. And that's the same love that we want extended to our young people in school. But what the difference is that love is unconditional love. So we don't need just people loving our students in our education spaces. We need that unconditional love for our young people in our education spaces too.
That's an awesome response. Martha, did you want to add something to that?
I do, and I know Joe Brummer's in this call, and he'd be unhappy with me if I didn't bring this up, is that not all of us, including me, don't want to come from a family where any of that existed and was modeled. So like the analogy to me is like, yeah, in a perfect family, but a lot of us don't come to that. So I think it's important we don't confuse restorative justice with forgiveness, because to me, forgiveness is sometimes a byproduct that comes along as part of the process, but that's not our goal. The goal is to make things right. But when you have students and adults who have unhealed trauma in their bodies and in their brains, some of that work to make things right means make things safe. Like what people who have trauma need is safety. So part of the restorative process might be uncovering those needs. Like there was an event, something happened. When that person comes back into the room, what does the person harmed need to feel safe again? What does that classroom, what does that teacher need to feel safe again, so that we can move forward, whether forgiveness happens or not.
Got it. That's great. Thank you. Let's go to one of our questions. So our first question, and I'll start with you, Martha. The question is, how do you see restorative justice looking similar and different for different age groups, elementary versus high school, across a school system, etc.?
Dwanna, I'm going to let you drill down on the specifics of that, but I just want to talk a little bit about the systems of those levels. There's two things. You have cognitive abilities, right? So a second grader's ability to actually think about, to answer the question, what were you thinking when you poked your classmate with a pencil? Like they may not have that cognitive awareness to answer that question. So, and Dwanna I think can speak more to this. So you have to adjust the questions. You also may have to adjust the questions for special needs kids with processing disorders or who are on the autism spectrum, just because this is all contextual. But just structurally, elementary schools, a lot of times elementary teachers they have circle time with their kids already. It may not be a truly restorative circle, but they're structured so like it's almost an easy transition for teachers to adapt the restorative dialogue type of circle. They tend to also have the same teacher all year long. Even in some elementary schools, they loop where the teacher moves up the grade with the kids. So there's tremendous opportunity at the elementary level to really work on that relationship and that trauma-informed, creating safe classrooms, building that safety.
Wonderful.
When you get to middle schools then, when the hormones set in and adolescence sets in, and middle schools historically have more fights than high schools and elementary schools, But structurally, a lot of middle schools also have something called an advisory period. And that is an opportunity for teachers to again, circle up with their kids and build those relationships. Then high schools become challenging because now you have these mini adults who think they know more than every adult in the whole high school. You may or may not have homerooms. So you have to be really creative about how to implement it in high school. But the cool thing is that those older kids, a lot will do the implementation themselves. Like they can become school leaders. They can be, even at the middle school level, peer mediators, take responsibility for themselves and each other, even more so than a lot of the adults in the schools. So it's very contextual. The basic theory and premise of restorative justice, though, stays the same throughout. It just looks differently in different spaces.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martha. Dwanna, we're going to go to you for the second question. If RJ should be invitational, what do we do when a student refuses to join a circle after behavioral misconduct or impacted staff who was too upset to join the circle? What are some best practices for that paradigm shift?
Sure. I just want to say, just for that last question, I appreciate that question. I also really appreciate the way similar was included in the question, because oftentimes it is this idea that it's one way in elementary, it's one way in middle, and it's one way in high school. And the reality is oftentimes we don't give our little babies enough credit. They are doing this too, and they are doing this all day, every day. They can pass a talking piece, they can answer the questions, and Martha's right, sometimes we have to change the questions a little bit, but they can do all of this. And so I appreciate just the way that question was asked. Certainly our restorative justice is an invitation, and I think this is one of the reasons why we actually don't want people starting with the harm. So if I'm used to being in circle to build community, if I'm used to being in circle to speak and to build connections with my classmates and others in my school community, then when there's harm done, I'm actually more likely to join the circle to address the harm. But because it can't be forced, we don't say, because we don't want restorative justice, we don't want circles to be seen as just another form of punishment. And when you mandate that somebody does something, that you have to sit in this circle, then that is forcing them to do it. And that is punishment. And so we always extend the invitation. Maybe the person who committed the harm isn't ready to sit with folks yet, and that's okay. You continue to extend the invitation. And as Martha was alluding to, if I throw a desk in my classroom, and I didn't just harm the teacher, I may have harmed the entire classroom community. That community can still sit together and talk about what happened and go into detail about what happened and start the healing process of what happened. Even if I'm not there, those conversations should still exist. When I'm harmed, I might not be ready to face the person who harmed me yet. And that is fine too. But maybe there are individual conversations that can happen with me, or individual conversations that can still happen with the person who committed the harm. But we continue to go back. At one point, I may be ready. I may never be ready, but at one point I may be ready. So we continue to extend the invitation. But it's really important that we don't force it, because the moment we start saying you must do it, that's the moment that it actually loses its effectiveness. And this is also the reason why it's really important to not start with the harm, that the first time a person is introduced to sitting in circles should not be after a harm has occurred. So it's like, how do we normalize circles in the school building so that when harm occurs, it's just a natural flow, right, from community building to harm spaces, because we've spent so much time building community.
Martha, did you want to touch on that one, or we go to the next question?
I had something I wanted to add to that, but I forgot what it was. So you can go on to the next one.
You can come back to it if you remember.
Oh, I did remember.
There you go.
You know, and this is also going to speak to the critics of restorative justice who refer to restorative justice as being soft, right? Because it's not punishment. And really, I would say to all those people, I challenge you to sit down across from somebody that you have caused harm to and own it and see how that feels, and ask the person across from you how it made them feel when you did that, and listen deeply to what they say and pay attention to how it feels. it's probably one of the hardest things you can do as a human being. And I am one of those people, honestly, that has a heck of a time apologizing to somebody. I hate it. I know how hard it is, and I know how my body feels when I have to do it. And there are kids who, given a choice to be part of a restorative process or take a suspension, have said and documented in studies, they took the suspension because it's easier. So if you want to talk about what's hard and what's soft, punishment's soft, punishment's easy, it's fast, and it is 100% ineffective. If you want to talk about what's hard on kids, and what's hard on adults, create a space for people to own their stuff and ask the question, what do I need to do to make this right? And then you'll understand just how darn hard this is. And then you'll also understand why so many people would just rather stay with the punitive system, because that's what's easy.
Yeah, psychological safety is well documented in its efficacy when it's present. Let's go to the next question. And Martha, we can start with you. Can you talk about the connection between, oh, and by the way, just a quick break. For those of you who are listening, if you would like to watch this video later on YouTube, we will be putting the link to our YouTube channel in the chat right now. One of our members will be putting the link to the YouTube channel. You can sign up to see the videos that we'll be putting there. And we'll probably be reaching out to you afterwards if you'd like to get emails on our future talks. We have 2 more scheduled for the next month or so. So here's the question. And also, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A box. So from an anonymous attendee, can you talk about the connection between restorative justice and racial justice? We'll start with you, Martha.
I'm going to be quick with that one. There is no restorative justice without racial justice. Like I said before, schools are part of a white supremacist system in this country that have caused tremendous harm. So if we're talking about creating school cultures where every human being in the school is treated with dignity and respect and is seen as inherently worthy just for showing up as who they are, we have to address racial equity, because this country does not operate under that set of values.
Yeah.
And in that way of thinking. And schools are simply a microcosm of our society. What we have in schools is kind of a captive audience. So we have an opportunity to do more racial equity work within really the confines of that building and the people in it than we might have within an entire nation or state or county. But there's a new book out called Colorizing Restorative Justice that has been a critique of the whiteness that has been inherent in restorative justice and the harm that has been done to people of color. And most of us are now on board in agreement that without racial equity, you don't have restorative justice. And this is an important message to get across, because education is extremely siloed. For example, with professional development, a school will send its teachers to trauma-informed practices, PD. Then they'll send them to social emotional learning, SEL. Then they'll do RJ. Then they'll do racial equity. And they're seeing these things as individual things. And what they really need to be doing is seeing these things as collectively, as a whole, as all integrated, interconnected, interactive parts of creating a more just and equitable learning environment within that school.
Dwanna, would you like to take the next question, or do you want to address that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, I mean, I see restorative justice as racial justice work, and one can't happen without the other. And we actually are very explicit about race in everything that we do because of it.
Great, thanks. So Dwanna, next question from Joe Brummer. What is your approach to leadership and whole school change? Funding and policy changes. So that's 3 big questions. Joe doesn't want anyone else to ask any questions.
Yes, these are also very important questions. And so when it comes to leadership, I kind of employ like a philosophy of the path of least resistance, right? We're going to the leaders who really want to do this work. We are starting with the leaders who really want to do this work because we recognize that leadership buy-in and ownership of this work is so inherently important. You can certainly try, and it's been done, right? I know schools where the educators have banded together to shift the climate of the school without the building leader on board. But I'll tell you, it's a whole lot easier when the building leader believes in this work and wants to do the work and understands that the work is long work. And so I'd say, you know, when we're identifying leaders who want to do it, we extend the invitation. We kind of, you know, explain what the process looks like, and then we work first with folks who are ready to run. I think funding is obviously incredibly important, and I know, and for school districts especially, this is a place where, you know, we're often working with like limited budgets, and so we're not. I mean, I think we all know we're not adequately funding the things that we need to fund. The work does cost money, right? It costs money in terms of professional development. It costs money in terms of hiring additional staff to own this work. And I think this is where, you know, the community advocacy piece is so important because in spaces and places where the work has really developed in a beautiful way, they've also have a strong community advocacy component as well that includes young people, that includes their families, who push the district to do the things that they say they're going to do, to hold the district accountable, to call the district out when what they're saying is not in line with their budgetary priorities. And it does, of course, mean policy change. Again, we are not trying to, and this was something that was done in many, many places a number of years ago after the Obama administration issued guidance on school discipline. We saw a rush of school districts change their codes of conduct. And what they would do is they simply implemented restorative justice as a thing that you can do. So, you know, restorative justice in tier 1, you can use restorative justice, often without any explanation of what that meant, without any training that followed that. So all of a sudden there was this thing that we could do, but no one actually knows what it is or how to do it. So policy change is important, and it's more than just like the words on the policy. It's actually what it means, right? So those codes of conduct, and they are still in existence in many, many places. I look at them and I'm just like, but if no one in the district knows what that means, essentially it's meaningless. And so you have that there as an option, but no one actually knows how to do it because the district hasn't undergone the work on training up folks. And so policies that, I'm talking about real policy change, right? Which means, how do we examine our policies in the first place to control for bias? How do we examine our policies to ensure there are policies that we know have a disproportionate impact on young people of color, young people with special needs, LGBTQ young people? How do we actually take that and try to eliminate the bias as much as we can out of those decision makings? How do we look at our curriculum? How do we look at our pedagogy? So we're talking about whole system policy change. And I think what Martha said earlier about this work being siloed in educational spaces, this really means, you know, using like an entire lens to look at the way our school buildings and our school systems are operating. A lot of how we operate, and this is just the nature of the history of education in this country, is not in line with this philosophy. And so what it really means is a rebuilding, a complete rebuilding oftentimes of our educational spaces. And that definitely includes policy change, but I would say real policy change, or policy change with actually teeth behind it, right? So if we're going to have restorative justice as an option that educators can use, then we need to make sure that our funding is in line to train and assist those educators so they can do this work.
Can I tell a story that relates exactly to this? It's a true story.
Yes, please.
I'm living now in Minnesota, but I was in Florida, and shortly after the Parkland shooting, all of a sudden the state of Florida had billions of dollars that were never available for education, certainly not for teacher pay, not for social workers, not for counselors. All of a sudden had billions of dollars at hand to fund armed school police officers. And the district in the county where I lived was about to get, I think, well, I don't know how many millions, 13 million, something like that, to put 75 armed school police in all the elementary schools. Now, not only is there no research that shows the effectiveness of armed police officers, and I don't remember how I got this meeting with the school board member, but I met with her and I took her my book and I said, please, before the meeting on Wednesday where you're going to vote to accept this money, read the first 2 chapters of my book, because you can take that money and instead of putting cops in elementary schools who are going to traumatize and arrest and be pulling 2nd graders out in handcuffs, which it took weeks for that to happen, weeks. You can take that
actually
money.
Happened is what you're saying.
Actually happened.
Yeah.
You can take that money and train unarmed school resource officers in restorative justice and conflict de-escalation, and actually put people who are going to support kids and support teachers in the schools instead of a bunch of cops who are going to criminalize kids. And, you know, we're watching the 6 o'clock news and watching 8-year-old girls in handcuffs sobbing for their mother being put in the backseat of a car. So I'm putting this out there, and I said this 2 years ago after Parkland, but it's even more ready now. If you're looking for funding, look at that school police budget. Because this is the same district that had an armed staff sergeant sitting at the desk of the school administration building, checking people's driver's license before they could get in for meetings. So you're paying what his salary was, his rank, plus benefits, over $100,000 for one individual to act as an administrative assistant in the administration building. And I stood there and I thought, do you know how much restorative justice training you could do for what you're paying that armed staff sergeant to sit in that seat? Not to mention the 2 other armed cops who were hanging out having coffee behind him, right? So I'm a little tired of hearing school districts say we don't have money for RJ because they've got it. I think they can look seriously at their existing budget and think about the terms reallocation. And if you're talking about a school district with their own police force that is armed, you can make serious changes there by going into unarmed SROs and reallocating some of that funds for restorative justice. And you will make the schools safer in the process. You will stop criminalizing behavior in the process.
All right, let's go to our next question. And I'll start with you, Martha. So the question is, first thing is a statement. It says, RJ is victim-centered. Is it necessary that the harm causer is present or engaged in the process? When I think about school children who act out, they are frequently not willing to open up and admit blame. That's the question.
First of all, I think it's important to situate that question on what Dwanna already said. If you're already doing the community building, if there's already connection, if there's already relationships established, then you've got something to go on. But just to have disconnection and commit harm and then expect someone to show up and own that, yeah. There's a lot of restorative processes where the victim is not present. They choose not to be. In that case, there can be surrogates, but also the facilitator of that. I also want to demystify that everything restorative justice is not necessarily circles. There are conferences. So it is possible to meet with the person who caused the harm separately, then go meet with the person who was harmed separately, and kind of have that mediator be the go-between until things are ready. And I'm going to just shoot it to Dwanna at this point to pick up on that.
Dwanna, you want to answer?
Sure. So I think if you, going back to, because I'm looking at the next question, I'm sorry, I have the questions pulled up just so I can make sure I'm like really answering them.
Do you want me to answer? You want me to give it to you again?
No, I see it now. And so, yeah, so I think that, so when in schools that really have done the work of building the community, the young people, because they know that they've hurt someone that they care about or that they're in a relationship with, actually do own up to it. And so I think again, right? The process flows. Now, sometimes, Martha was saying earlier, you may ask the question about, why a certain behavior, why they did a certain thing, and their answer may very well be, I don't know. And I think that is actually the answer. That is their answer. And I think sometimes we see that as, oh, you don't want to tell the truth, or you really do know. Of course, the reality is that sometimes, even as adults, I sometimes harm folks, and I don't fully understand the extent of what I did. I cannot relate back to exactly the harm that I caused. I don't know why I do certain things. Maybe I'm hungry, maybe I'm sleepy, it could be a very small thing, it could be a very large thing. So the answer, I don't know, I feel is actually a valid answer. And sometimes I know, just even as being a mom or an aunt, right, getting the I don't know back, I had to recondition myself out of the space where, my niece isn't being disrespectful or not trying to own up or anything like that. She actually doesn't know. And so then what is my role in that situation to try to explain why, certain behavior, we don't want to see certain behavior, or what do you really need, or what are you communicating with that behavior? But I have actually seen in spaces where that community is present, the young people actually, they don't want to cause harm. They don't want to hurt other people that they care about. And so when they hear that they have hurt folks, they do want to make it right. And they may not know how to express that, or they may not know how to say that the way we're able to communicate it, but they want to make it right. And often we just need to kind of show them and then create spaces for them to be able to do that. But again, that doesn't happen if the community building doesn't happen first.
Great. I know that
we adults, we do this thing, right, where we we look at young people and we think they have the same executive functioning and reasoning capacity as a full-scale adult. We inflict adulthood on children, and then we view them that way, and we treat them accordingly, right? The executive functioning part of the brain doesn't even fully mature in males until the ages of 25 to 28. So
55, 55.
I'm still working on mine, I'm 54. And so it's like we stand on the outside looking down at these kids, expecting them to have the full emotional, intellectual maturity of an adult that sometimes we as adults don't even have. So, my God, let's cut the kids a break. They're young people and they're developing. And so when we look at harm, not as rule breaking, but as broken relationships. And if we look at those as mistakes, and if we look at those as opportunities, as real deep learning and teaching opportunities to learn how my behavior affects yours, now we're teaching. Now we're back into education, and now we're back into human development. But we have got to really check our adult brain judgy at the door when we're working with young people, and give them way more credit than we ever do.
So Leanne Roselle is asked the question, but I think we addressed it. Leanne, I'm just going to ask, did we address your question? She asked, how should schools that adopt restorative justice think about their SROs? Do you think we kind of covered that, or do we want to address that again? Dwanna, Martha?
So I will say, I don't think the two can coexist. I don't know if you can have a school and say, we're restorative justice school, and have an armed police officer walking through the hallway. Because the very nature of restorative justice is saying that, when there's harm done to our community, we come together and we are able to sit together and repair that harm. We don't need any outside folks coming in and frankly committing more harm for some of our young people, or punishing or arresting our young people. And I think just about myself, right? I'm not in school right anymore. I'm an adult. And when I see groups of police officers walking around, I am afraid. And so I can't even imagine. I did not have police in schools when I was in school. I can't imagine going to school every day certainly with all that's going on in the world right now, but even before, right? And having someone with a gun on their hip who can take my life at any moment in an educational space. And so the two do not, I don't see how the two coexist.
Yeah,
to be
right.
honest.
I wanted to just point out someone, Sherry said here, in my experience, adults in the school have been more likely to not take responsibility for doing harm than the kids. And I just wanted to frame a question around responsibility. So my understanding, so every word has an interpretive meaning, right? For me, responsibility is not something anyone can put on me. It's something that I have to be willing to take. And depending on what my perception of the potential outcomes are, will affect how much of that responsibility I'll take. So for example, if I commit a harm with my wife, I know that she's not going to have me arrested or leave the house, that I'm willing to accept, hey, I screwed that up, I messed that up, because I know that she loves me, and that whatever afterwards occurs is not going to be fatal. But I don't think that's true in our world. And the court system is set up that if you are the defendant, that you just deny, and defend yourself. And at work and other cultural settings, it's set up to reject culpability, right? Because the punishments and it's punishment, right, can be severe, and you want to protect yourself, right? That's a human brain thing, to protect ourselves. That's fundamental to human being. I mean, our amygdala and our basal ganglia and all those parts of our brains are designed to keep us safe. So how do we, and I know you've talked about it a bit, but how do we traverse that line of saying, hey, you can say that you did this and it is not going to be that bad, right? So that it's safe to take responsibility, to own something. Because ownership of a thing like that is it's a very sophisticated and mature action, I think.
So I think that's right, Lauren. But I also feel like Sherry's comment is actually like spot on. I think so. The nature of our traditionally of our educational institutions is that the adults have the power over the young people, right? And so when I make a mistake as an adult, one, right, it's not always counted as a mistake, right? It is just something that, I am. And we often do not apologize to the young people that we are harming. A few years ago, my colleague, really wanted to do some work around, this tie between trauma-informed practices and restorative justice. And I was, while I agree with that the two go hand in hand, I was like, yeah, except for there's trauma happening in schools every day that adults are inflicting on young people every day. And unless we're going to talk about that trauma too, I would rather that we just stay away from it. And so we make sure that when we talk about trauma, it's not just about what young people are experiencing at home or anything like that. It's also about the trauma that is inflicted upon them when they are in schools. And I have seen this with my own eyes. I have seen young people called out for being just children. I have seen certain young people be labeled as bad. I have seen young people, this had happened to me when I was in school, never called on, completely dismissed as even a person in a space. That happens all the time. Young people being silenced. We strip away the voice of young people in school. And then we complain when they're in high school about how they don't have a voice, right? But we took it away. And so part of this work actually means adults sharing power with young people, right? It's not power over. And it also means that adults taking responsibility when they cause harm. And it's true that, it's tough to take the act of taking responsibility is something that you work at, that you work towards. But what's also true is that in our education spaces, because we see young people as just these minds that we are molding and not actually as full as developed or developing individuals, we don't give them, we do not give them almost like the same rights or responsibilities that we want as adults. And
So
so
Dwanna, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to kind of drill down on this one because I think it is key to a lot of what we're talking about. In the school system, a teacher has a job, and if they make a mistake, at risk is their livelihood, right? A student, if something happens, their risk is that they get suspended or they're kicked out of school. They're both bad, right? But how do we kind of cut the ends off of how bad the punishment could be? Unless, of course, it's like a crime, like an actual crime, right? We're not talking about crimes, we're talking about harms, right? When a teacher said the wrong thing, or they were, they just spoke in the wrong way, whatever. How do we kind of say, look, you're not going to lose your job. This is not going to like be a ding on your, your whole career, so that they now feel safe to embrace that. And I mean that specifically, that specific kind of responsibility.
I just want to go back to where we started this conversation, that we are really talking about full scale, top to bottom, side to side systems change. And as I've been thinking about the kind of questions coming in, folks are kind of like trying to find a way to take restorative justice and plug it in to this very broken, unjust, punitive system. And, even Kay Prana said, and Dwanna said it tonight, like schools as we know them, there is no foundation there upon which to lay this work. So to look at these types of things individually without looking at the whole system really won't get us where we need to be. Because at the same time, people are being trained, and those people include school board members and principals and district superintendents. At the same time, they are learning about RJE. One of their jobs will then be to look at their policies. As their own lens changes and starts to shift from punitive and restorative, then can they apply that new lens to the policies? Can one of the assignments be, in addition to their book club readings and their studies, is go pull out and bring in your teachers union. Go pull out your list of punishments, the things that you do to teachers, the things that you do to traumatize the adults that then you're putting in front of kids every day and wondering why they're traumatizing students, right? This has to be that big. It has to be that systemic.
So what you're saying is an answer to my question is that those harms that teachers would experience would also be addressed as part of the system change, because I think we all get that this isn't just moving the furniture on the Titanic.
No, and it has to be. And again, the historic model is it's like we're going to train teachers how to do restorative practices on their kids, and we're not going to do anything about administrators who bully teachers, and we're not going to do anything about teachers bullying each other or gossiping. We're not going to do anything with the adults. And the kind of restorative justice that Dwanna and I really believe in addresses all of that. Because kids watch, adults are modeled, they watch and look, and if they see hypocrisy, they're going to call it out, and they're going to say, same thing that they said in my research, in my book, why do we have to do this if they don't?
Got it.
It's got to be holistic and systemic.
I want to just let people know that who are listening, we're at the 1 hour mark. We're going to go a little bit longer. If there's questions that you have, put them in the QA. I got to say, I don't feel like my question was answered exactly. But and I'm okay with it. Is there anything?
So you want to take a stab?
Yeah, so I'll actually say, when you started your question, Lauren, you talked about like if a teacher makes a mistake that they could lose their livelihood, and that if a young person, does something, they could be suspended or expelled. But that suspension or expulsion is also a very serious thing. So that
I'm saying they're equivalent. I'm just saying these are the worst things that can happen. Yeah. And those are the things that is in that person's mind of, I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to do everything I can to not let that happen, including not owning it and not saying I did something wrong. That's my point.
Yep. And so for like the administrators that we work with, and we say this all the time, right? And so for example, I know educators who are like, well, I really want to do this work and I really want to build these relationships. I want to invest the time in building relationships with my students, but I know I have to teach. And I know if someone walks past my door while I'm sitting in circle, right, I may be dinged for that. And then that is the reason though that we talk to their building leaders, their principals, right? Because if you have a principal who believes in this work, then when they walk past your door and they see you sitting in circle, they're actually not going to ding you. Or I know a math teacher who, 2 years ago started doing this work, and she spent a considerable amount of time at the beginning of the year and before each class building strong relationships with her students. At the mid-year part of the year, she was behind all the other math classes in the school building. But she stayed the course. And by the end of the year, she was ahead of everyone. And the reason that was because once the relationships were established, the learning happened like that. She made up the time in the air. But not one time was she ever worried about her principal walking by her classroom door and seeing her playing games or relationships or doing things that did not have anything to do with math on the surface with her children, because her principal was on board and supported her work. And so that's why it starts with leadership, that we can't do the work just with educators in silos. We have to talk to building leaders and we have to talk to central office staff because it does have to be a systemic approach.
So I have a question. I have two questions here. One from Andral, and I think we answered the question, but I'll just put it out there again. Her question, or his question, excuse me, do you think that it's important for school leaders to demonstrate the same grace and mercy when dealing with teachers that inflict harm in the way that they expect the teachers to interact with the students? That was, I think, maybe another way of the question I had asked.
Yes.
Yes.
How else are teachers going to learn how to be better and do better?
Yeah. Yeah, that's. Now I got another question here from Joe. What is the role of unions? And Martha, why don't you kick that off?
I really don't know if I can answer that, other than they are also stakeholders who need to be brought in and engaged from the outset. And every school has their union representatives. So the union is in the school, those people are in the school. So inviting them to be engaged at the outset is really critical. And there may be opportunities to talk with union leaders about how restorative justice could benefit them. But in the courses that I taught, I had a lot of my adult students who worked in the field of human resources and contract negotiations. And I can't remember the word for when you have a contractual issue in a union. But
arbitration
yes, that structure is inherently adversarial, and there's nothing restorative about it. And so they were really torn because it was us against management. It was set up in a very unrestorative way. So that's a big bite. But just engaging them early and getting their support. And I will say, Dwanna, it's the NEA, right? The National Educators Association, the country's largest teachers union, has endorsed restorative justice, and they have information about it on their website.
They both have. So when I was at Advancement Project, my job essentially at the time was to talk to stakeholders who typically, we represent like young people organizers, young people and family organizers who were opposed to the school to prison pipeline. At the time, unions were supportive of zero tolerance policies. That has turned, right? And so we actually, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers have both endorsed restorative justice. And in the work that I do, the local school level, we are always talking to the unions. The union is a partner in our work. In one district that I'm working in, the union is actually funding the restorative justice work in the school district and has been funding it until the district could figure out a way to continue the funding itself. And the beauty in that is that in schools where there are educators who are like, this is going to go away in a year or two, I don't want to do this, I don't believe in this, I actually have the union president standing next to me saying, I believe in this work, and this is the work that we as a union are going to do, and this is the work that we want to see in our schools. And it's okay if you don't want to do this, but this school, this is where we're going, and we will help you find another place that's better suited for you. But this going in this school, and how powerful it is when she says that, because she's getting all the complaints, right? And she's always able to say, she says it from the very beginning, from the very first staff meeting, I believe in this work and I'm supporting the schools in this work. And it makes our work so much easier, because in a lot of spaces, that's not the case. In a lot of spaces, the union locally has been drastically opposed to this work, even though the national unions have both endorsed it.
Well,
One of the schools I write
yeah.
about in my book, this school was just rocking it with restorative justice, and one of the biggest advocates and leaders was also the union rep for that school, and her mother used to be the president of that local teachers union, right? So there was a lot of union power in that particular school. And what that did was it gave them the opportunity, when a new principal came in and he defined himself, he called himself Mr. Heavy-Handed, I'm Mr. Turnaround, is that those teachers under her leadership said to him, we don't do it that way here. We do it the restorative way. And they actually helped him shift his leadership style in that school, because they weren't going to let a non-restorative leader destroy all of the work they had been doing for the past 5 years. And in fact, he listened and he learned and he helped make it stronger.
Well, I want to thank you so much. And we're at 65 minutes. If there is not another question, I'll give a minute for another question, like a last question. And if not, I want to thank everyone who participated. You have great questions. There was about 10 awesome questions. And thank you, Dwanna. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And please thank your daughter for us. We really appreciate her letting you be here, because I know that's a big deal. And Martha, thank you for being here in the Central Time Zone. We appreciate that. And for all the great input that you both had to offer. So with that, I will say we're complete. Again, please check out our YouTube channel. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Can I make some closing remarks?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. We're informal here.
I don't want this to come across like I'm plugging my book, Creating Restorative Schools, but I'm plugging my book, and here's why. Because I've talked to educators all across the United States and Canada who have told me how incredibly useful it was, and it's actually a book they go through the second time, because it not only teaches you what it is, it gives you a case study of two very different schools in two very different stages of implementation. So there's real stuff, and there's voices of kids and there's voices of the teachers. And one of the big points I make, and then I'll stop talking, in the book, is that restorative justice is not something you throw at disproportionate discipline or something you do to fix broken kids. It's not a quick fix, and it is complex. If you get in it, you're getting in it for the long game, because we're talking about systemic change. We're talking about a paradigm shift. We're talking about doing education differently. And if you read that, you can kind of get the vision of what it looks like to be in that messy, complex process. And again, going back to No Child Left Behind, schools now are very used to, we're going to try something this year, and if it doesn't raise test scores by 20 points, we're going to try something the next year. They have now been 30 years in the pattern of doing the next big thing. Restorative justice in education is not the next big thing. It's if you want to change your school for the better, to make it more just and equitable, and for the long term, you're going to invest in the learning and invest in the processes and in the training and do that hard work of doing it. And if you do that, the test scores are going to take care of themselves, because your kids are going to be safe. They're going to be more engaged. They're going to want to be there. The teachers will stick around more. There will be less turnover. People will be happier at their jobs. It'll just be a better learning environment. Then, with less conflict and less unhappiness and less tension and less punishment, you've now opened up the space for real deep learning. And that's what we want from our kids.
Awesome.
So thanks.
You're welcome. Dwanna, did you want to say anything as we close out?
I just want to thank everyone for joining this evening. And just to let you know that the work that you're doing is so important. in the spaces where this work has really taken off and it has been sustainable, there's one common thread, and that is that there has been an active and engaged community who've been able to hold the school district, who've been able to hold schools accountable to this work, to hold all systems accountable to this work. And so it just warms my heart. There are folks out there who are pushing for this change. And so I wish you the best of luck in what you're doing. And we have a lot of free resources on our website, rjpartnership.org, and recordings of webinars that kind of get to a lot of the points that were mentioned here. Please utilize them all. They are there for you. They've been built with both educators and families and community members in mind. And a lot of the building comes from requests that we have. And so it's always been because of a need. And so, but just good luck in the work that you all are doing. It's such important work.
Thank you. I want to do a shout out to Kateri Gajadar. Kateri is our social media and communications expert. She's doing a great job. Also, Philip DeMiglio in Vermont. Philip's taking woodworking classes. He's been doing a lot of our technology stuff and editing our videos. Peter Rusolo, and the crew. There's tons of room. And of course, Carissa, who's on the line, she's kind of leading this effort. We really appreciate that. And of course, Leanne Roselle. So thanks to all of our wonderful people who are doing all this good work. And we'll see you the next time in a couple of weeks. You'll hear about the next one. Take care.